Today being a baptism day, I thought it would be fair to start with a children's story that ties in a bit to our text today. Perhaps you know the story. About 150 years ago, right alongside the first edition of The Little Mermaid, came another story called The Emperor's New Clothes. Perhaps you know it. It's a story of a rather vain emperor who wants very badly to impress and look good to his subjects. So he hires some weavers of clothing who convince him of a suit that they will make that is of incredible beauty. The weavers add one key detail about this suit that they will make for him. They say that it will be invisible to anyone who is a simpleton or who is unfit for their position. Now, the weavers are con artists. They are actually weaving no outfit at all, but everybody plays along with it. So the king is not allowed to see this thing until it is produced finally, but those who go and see it in production, though they see nothing at all when they're looking at it, they come out pretending that they've seen the most exquisite outfit they've ever seen. When it's finished, the king finally also goes in to view this outfit, and the same thing happens to him. He sees nothing at all, but he is afraid, like the others, of being exposed as a simpleton or being unfit for his position. And so he comes out also proclaiming how wonderful this outfit would be. There finally comes a day for a royal processional through the town, and so the king goes and he puts on this outfit. And he goes out into public pretending that all things are normal. But all things are not normal, are they? The outfit was a scam, and everyone is only pretending that they see it on him and chattering about how beautiful this outfit is. No one will admit it, even the king, until finally a child off in the corner, one unconformed to the pressures of society, the child shouts out, "But the emperor has no clothes on." And it's true, and everybody then starts to realize the innocence of the child is accurate, and the king knows it too, but he has to finish this processional, and that's how the story ends. That story has some parallels to our story of the Bible today, as we have our text about David finally being crowned king. So we have this king, and it happens to be David, the one we already know all too much about, right? And he becomes king because the Israelites have this pressure to conform around them. They want a king because they want to be like all the nations. And our story today will end with this very king, King David, prancing through the streets in his underwear. Maybe you know the story. We'll read it. But before we do, let's join together in prayer. Oh God, we live in a world of stories. In fact, it has been said that we tell ourselves stories in order to live. And then we live by the stories we tell. So help us, God, please, to get the story straight. And today, as we lean into the stories of David, I pray that you will send your Spirit on us, that in your light we may see light, in your truth find freedom, and in your will may we know peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So today we actually have 3 stories from our text, and we're going to take them one at a time. So you're going to get to say, "This is the word of the Lord," 3 times together with me. The first one is the story of David finally being crowned king. 2 Samuel chapter 5. We'll do just the first 3 verses here. It says this: "Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, 'Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel.' So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they appointed David king over Israel." This is the word of the Lord. That, friends, is the first story, and it is the story of David being crowned king. Now, you might know David was not the first king of Israel. Saul came before him, but Saul really only achieved what might better be described as a chiefdom. He didn't quite unify all of the nations. Only in the story that we just read do the tribes of both Israel and Judah come together and say, David, we want you to be our king. Well, sort of. It's actually the narrator who uses the word king repeatedly. There's a different term that the elders of Israel and even God prefers to use instead. Did you notice what it was? Shepherd. The word that they seem to prefer to use for their king is shepherd. It got me thinking that it seems to be that the presumption behind having a leader who is a shepherd assumes that we, the people, then are like sheep, right? And if people are like sheep, this became the question for me to ponder. What is it about sheep that makes us like them? As you might guess, I have zero experience with sheep, so I turned where else? To Google to figure this out, and this might not surprise you either. There's a variety of answers put forth by Google, always. Some say that sheep are dumb, and therefore we are like them. And some say that sheep are smart, and therefore we are like them. But what seems to run through it all, and is accurate to our scriptures as well, is that sheep are followers. Followers. That's what sheep do. They follow. In fact, we talked about this a few weeks ago in the Apprentice of Jesus class, and afterwards, someone sent out a video about a dog that comes up upon a herd of sheep, and the dog gets spooked by the sheep, so it starts to run from the sheep. And what do the sheep do? They chase it. So it becomes this endless game of running in circles with the dog. Some sociological studies have been done to show how we are, in fact, like sheep. We follow. One study took a group not quite this big, about 200 people, and put them in a room like this one, and told everybody to just wander around aimlessly, go wherever you go. But 5% of those 200 were given specific instructions to walk a certain pattern throughout the room. Do you know what happened? It didn't take long for the rest of the group to figure out which ones had some purposefulness to their way, and everybody simply started following them. It's the herd mentality, where we start to go in a certain way as a herd. I found some photos, actually, where a person sat in a city, let's go to the next slide there, and started just taking photos over a short amount of time. So here we are in Paris, 1.5 hours time, and you got all of these different fellows with that same man purse or European carry-all thing. They're all different in the same way. They have the same thing over a short amount of time. Jump to Amsterdam, and now we have the pink tank top, which was 2 hours time. All of these same people wearing a very, very similar thing. Next city was New York, you might guess, the place of the women in fur coats. And then this last one's my favorite, Amsterdam again, but now it's the fellas. And only 1 hour's time, right? That's that many of them. It's the invasion of denim, right? So everybody being different in the same way. So it's this herd mentality. When I was in college, took a sociology class with a great professor named Don Leidens. Perhaps you know him. And we did a little social experiment in our class while we were together. And he said to the students who arrived early, he said, before the other ones showed up, we're going to agree together that at 10 minutes after in this class, everyone is going to just stand up, unprompted, and without any comment about it. We're just going to do that. So the late arrivers, about 25% of them, didn't know what was happening. 10 minutes into the class comes along, and all of a sudden everybody stands up. Guess what the others did? They stood up too, and you say, well, why'd you stand up? Everybody else did, right? I'm telling you these stories, and there's lots of other examples as well, because when it comes to Israel seeking to have a king over them, the recurring theme is they want a king because they want to be like the other nations. They come to God, and the request is always, God, give us a king that we may be like them, that we might be like the other nations. And it's a really odd request because it goes against the grain or in the opposite direction of what God was otherwise seeking to do with his own people. God was otherwise trying to raise up a peculiar people who were not like all the others so that they could be a positive influence in the world. And so when they come to God and keep saying, we want a king because we want to be like the other nations, God never really commends the idea. God finally just grants permission. And when God does grant permission, God adds a couple rules or even laws that end up being the only law in the Old Testament that include the condition that you can do this so that you can be like the other nations. Deuteronomy 17 is the key verse here. Let's put it on the screen. We won't read the whole thing, but I highlighted some of the words for you. So you see in yellow, there's the request. We want a king because we want to be like the nations. And then in blue, God says, you may indeed set a king over you. And then there's 5 conditions that get put forward in this text, Deuteronomy 17. The first is that if you're going to have a king, it's got to be one that God appoints. And so there it is in green, the one the Lord your God will choose. Then there's 3 kind of rules or negative things that the king must avoid. Basically, it's saying the king must not have too many horses, too many wives, or too much gold. That's what those 3 in the middle are. It's the ancient equivalent to the modern perennial temptations of money, sex, and power. The king must be guarded from having these 3 things and too much of them. Not too much money, sex, or power. That's not good for kings. And then the last instruction goes back to the positive. It says that the king ought to have a copy of the law that he is able to read daily. So the king is to have that in front of them. With that in the background, and the people knew it, they finally are seeking to anoint this new king, King David. And you notice in the text that we read, God and the elders of Israel avoid using this term king. They say shepherd. They want David to be a shepherd king. He is to be one who is notably unlike all of the other kings because he is to be shepherding a peculiar people in a peculiar way. In fact, we've got that little image up top there where there's a very different one among the others. It's in many ways, that's what's intended for David to be among the people. I want to pause just a second before we go to the next story and try to put the wheels on the ground for you because this is a little odd couple verses, but it gives us a window into what God seems to think about how his people are to lead in the world. Not in the typical ways of kings, but rather instead in the way of a shepherd. And I believe that any and all of you lead somewhere, whether it's in a business or in politics or in medicine or in your own family or in education or in your neighborhood. Everybody leads somewhere. And I want to invite you to simply take pause and notice this term that God puts forth, shepherd. Shepherds seek the well-being of the sheep. They do not use the sheep to enhance or build up themselves. They shepherd for the sake of the sheep. And even Jesus would be the one who would lay down his life for the sake of the sheep. So wherever you lead, can you wonder what it would be like to lead like a shepherd? All right, let's go to the next story, because the next thing that you might wonder is, what does David do right after he's crowned king? But I have a question for it first. Here's the question. Was David a good or a bad king? Right? Yeah, I hear a lot of mumbling out there. The accurate answer is probably yes and yes. He was both a good and a bad king, in the same way that it's probably an oversimplification to say that a sheep or sheep are dumb or smart. More accurate to say sheep are sheep. It's probably also more accurate to say of David that David was David, or maybe even better, that David was human. And, kind of like the emperor from our opening story, the one who had no clothes, we just so happen to know more about David than maybe we even want to know, right? You know many of the stories. Movies have been made out of them. David does great things, and David does terrible things. You might know many of the stories, but this next story might be a little unfamiliar, so I want you to hear this. The first thing David does after he's crowned king is this. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 6. It says, "And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, 'You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off,' thinking, 'David cannot come in here.' Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David, and David said on that day, 'Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let them go up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul.' Therefore it is said, 'The blind and the lame shall not come into the house.' And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built a city around him from the Milo inward, and David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him." This is the word of the Lord. I admire your robustness in saying that because that story is a bit offensive, isn't it? 3 times over it mentions the blind and the lame, and there's the really awkward line in there that makes it sound like David even hated the blind and the lame. It doesn't make sense. In fact, you might know, we know for sure that David did not hate people with disabilities. Of all the people in antiquity, David is a shining example of a person who actually sought out and was consistently good to someone who was in a tough spot. The story is in 2 Samuel chapter 9, if you want to go and read it. The name of the boy/man is Mephibosheth, King Saul's grandson. King Saul hated David. Jonathan's son, David's best friend. This boy's name is Mephibosheth, and the text says that Mephibosheth was crippled in both feet. And yet David, when he's crowned king, he seeks out Mephibosheth. He restores his fortunes. He treats him well when he doesn't have to. And 4 times over in that text, it says that Mephibosheth shared table fellowship with David his whole life long. David welcomed Mephibosheth to his table. David did not hate the lame and the blind, which makes you wonder, what is up with this story about the blind and the lame then? Let me tell you my favorite interpretation that I found. It comes from Eugene Peterson, who leans into a Jewish rabbi of the Middle Ages, in case you want to track down the details. But the story goes like this. Picture an old city, J.R. Tolkien style, Lord of the Rings. I think we have an image. Not quite that grand, but something like that. This is the city of the Jebusites. They lived in a spooky city called Jebus. And the Jebusites were seemingly a recluse people. Nobody bothered the Jebusites. In fact, in the stories of the Old Testament, the time of the conquest, there's all these different battles between the Canaanites and the Israelites and the Hittites and the Amorites and all the other ites. But the Jebusites stay out of it all. They had somehow, interestingly, convinced the whole region that their city was haunted. So Peterson describes it this way. Listen in. He says, "It sat there, squat and grotesque, a small fortress city on a rock outcropping. It was a cheerless place. Travelers avoided it. It was virtually unassailable. To the east and south, the ground fell away sharply into deep ravines and a natural defense. Anyone ascending the slope of plains from either direction would be stopped by the sight of 2 huge demonic figures, misshapen bodies, distorted faces, set on the north and west walls of the city. One was an evil parody of limping Jacob, who had been lamed in his all-night wrestling match with the angel at the brook of Jabbok. The other was an equally evil parody of blind Isaac, who in his sightless old age had been hoodwinked by his wife and son. When anyone approached those walls, the figures would slowly begin to move, jerking, lurching movements, while at the same time, huge belches sounded from deep within, then shrieks of terror. It was an evil place. People stayed clear of it. Nobody bothered the Jebusites." But now David was not easily intimidated by displays of evil. And besides, he knew something of these fearsome figures. During his years of fugitive living in the wilderness, he had picked up bits and pieces of information regarding these reclusive Jebusites. He had good reason to suspect that those huge figures on the walls weren't demons at all, but mechanical forms hooked up to a neat piece of hydraulic engineering. Someone had only to move a lever, and the force of water from the spring Gahan, piped into place through an ingenious system of plumbing, would set lame Jacob and blind Isaac spookily moving and lurching, while a contrivance of bellows produced the belches and screams. He knew it was a fraud. There was nothing to it but pipes and pulleys, hinges, and smoke. That interpretation, though imaginative, is not disproved by archaeology. In fact, here's a city of the actual, an image of the actual excavation of this city called Jebus. And all you need to do is imagine a little darker lighting and a little more Halloween trickery, and the place could be quite spooky, right? And if there were indeed, as this interpretation says, these mocking statues of the patriarchs, Isaac and Jacob, guarding the city, it would then now finally make sense when it says that David hated the blind and the lame. They were things that were mocking his faith and even his God. And so, you may have noticed in the text, there's a really obscure line. Verse 8 says that David says this, "Whoever would strike down the Jebusites, let them get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind." Well, what water shaft? That one. This is a cross-section of that same ancient city. It has been discovered that there's this underground waterway that was piped into the city, and David knew about it. It was the one that animated these spooky things that sat on the edges of the city. And so David plans a plan, and he says, go into the city through the waterway and dismantle the spooky things. And then the commander of David's armies did just that. He went into that place, and then he probably went right up to the front door and opened it and let the army right in. It's a fascinating story. There is no mentioning of killing in this story. In fact, if you nerd out on it, like I obviously have done, Joshua 15, verse 63 is the verse that says, no one was able to conquer this city of the Jebusites. And then, finally, after this happens, it says that the people of Jebus and the people of Jerusalem lived together even to this day. It seems to be that the city was taken without a single casualty. Fascinating. So David moves into the city. He unspooks its spooky things. He ousts its idolatry. And then he makes that place ready for what he intends to do next. I want to pause again here and say, how do we put the wheels on the ground here? What might this story actually be about, besides just being fascinating? I think it's another one of these great stories in which we see a David who is very relatable to each and every one of us. Here we have David in all of his shrewd brilliance. It is a shrewd move of him to do this. He figures out a way to conquer the unconquerable city. And it's brilliant because he is now king over the United Kingdom, and this is a territory that sits right on the border between the two. It belongs to neither of them, so it's neutral territory. And when he takes it without destroying it. And then it becomes for him as easily defendable as it was for them, except for the waterway trick. In the words of Jesus, you might say this is a great instance in which David was as wise as a serpent and as innocent as a dove. There are other times where he is less so, but this is one of those good moments, and I think we can learn from him. David is incredibly relatable to us, and I would contend that today, many of you may not be looking to conquer a city called Jebus or to do so by going up some weird waterway, but I would contend that today, like then, is still calling for Christians to be equally shrewd and brilliant as David was, to create a way to unspook the spooky things in this world that still are haunting and scaring us, and to find a way to create a new, good future in this world. That's what David did, and I think we can learn from him. But the question lingers. We got one more story to get to. Having emptied this great city, which becomes David's capital, having emptied Jebus of its spooky things, what does David bring in? That's what our next story is. So listen in now to the story as it comes to us in the first few verses of 2 Samuel chapter 6. This is what it says. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000 of them. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baale, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on a hill. Then verse 14. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. Verse 16. As the ark of the Lord came to the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, David's wife, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him. And they brought the ark of the Lord in and set it in its place. This is the word of the Lord. Well, there you have it. The emperor in no clothes, very embarrassing to his wife, dancing in front of the ark. The question I think is worth asking for us right here is that what was in that ark that made it worthy of David dancing before it? There were three things that were utmost importance. The first was the stone tablets on which were carved the Ten Commandments. Those would represent for the people guidance or even laws that the king was supposed to read, like Deuteronomy said, daily. That was the first thing that was in there. The second thing that was in the ark was a jar of manna. The manna would be helping them to remember God's daily provision in the wilderness as they were escaping Egypt and moving towards the promised land. So guidance and daily provision. And then the third thing was Aaron's budding staff. Aaron was Moses' sidekick. The budding staff would represent for them God's strength to save no matter what. So David unspooks the spooky city, and what does he do next? He brings in the ark of God because he wants to build a city that is centered around God's guidance, God's help, and God's hope of salvation. As Reformed Christians, we ought not to let this slide past us too quickly. David is literally, in these chapters, building a word-centered community that is bent on living the with God life. A word-centered community bent on living the with God life. After all, it was David. Of all the kings, it was David who was the one who repeatedly inquired of the Lord before he took decisive action in the world. That's unique, and David did it. It was also David, among all the other kings, David was the one who chronicled his life with God in the book of Psalms. Somewhere around half of the Psalms were authored by David. It was his way of talking of this life with God that he had. That's peculiar, and that's what he brought the people into. It's no wonder with those two things, a word-centered and a with God life, our New Testament looks back on the stories of David and says, this, despite all of his other shenanigans, David was a man after God's own heart. So let me put the wheels on the ground one last time. See if this sounds a bit familiar for our culture today. Prior to David going out to retrieve this ark from the upper hill country where it sat for 30 years, out of sight and out of mind, that's where it was. David took this decisive action to go get it and bring it back. That was what he wanted to do. He wanted to bring the ark into his city, a new city and a new way of being in the world. The ark would represent for him the way that the people were to be. Not perfect people, but serving a God who would give them guidance, help along the way, and hope of salvation for sure. On today, a baptism day, what better could we do than take a page from David's book and become, for the sake of the next generation, become a people who seek out to live a word-centered and a with God life. Word-centered and with God. For the sake of the kids that we just baptized, right? For Emery, for Charlotte, for Weston, for Wren, can we be that kind of people, word-centered and with God? For the sake of our life together, can we live that way? Let it be so. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.